If you've been following my channel or Twitter account for a while, you already know two things I really love are 90s FPS games and Warhammer 40k. And if you knew that, and you'd heard about the recent release of Warhammer 40k Boltgun, you're probably expecting me to be ecstatic about it. Warhammer 40k Boltgun is the latest in a long line of so-called retro shooters, FPS games designed to resemble those of the 90s such as Doom, Quake, and the build engine games like Blood and Duke Nukem 3D. They are typically characterized by the use of simple, low-res textures, 2D sprites like early 90s FPS games or low poly count models like in the latter half of the decade, and straightforward combat, normally involving large numbers of enemies, something which is very suited to the Warhammer 40k universe. When they first started to appear, retro shooters were a welcome change from the Call of Duty Battlefield-dominated FPS genre. Your player character is fast, you dodge projectiles, and there aren't a ton of features or cutscenes to interrupt the gameplay. That being said, in recent years I've started to feel the retro or 90s throwback shooter genre is getting a little saturated, and sometimes the term is used as a way to cover for laziness. Of all the shooters I've played in this genre, only maybe one or two really impressed me and had me coming back for more. But of course Boltgun should be a shoo-in, right? This isn't just a retro FPS, it's based on one of my favorite franchises and a hobby that sucked up a lot of my disposable income in 2020 and 2021. Oh no, oh god. Oh, the pile of shame, no. So, was it a hit then? Well, having played through the game, I'd have to say my reaction is mixed. I'm not saying it's bad, but it's complicated. The game avoids some of the pitfalls of other retro shooters, and it does faithfully recreate the 40k universe, but it fell short in a few key areas. In its defense, however, I must say that after I wrote this script, I began a second playthrough, and this is going to sound weird, but I discovered some graphics options that you could tweak to make the game look a whole lot better. These are the settings right here. I can't really explain why, but for some reason the game felt a lot more enjoyable when I played it on these settings. And I'm mostly a gameplay before graphics guy, but I also believe that retro should never be a cover for looking like shit. In general, it's a solid premise. You play as a space marine of everyone's favorite chapter, the Ultramarines. Yeah, I know. Named Malum Kaido. And you're tasked with slaughtering hordes of heretics and demons, mostly with your handy chainsword, and of course the titular bolter rifle. Now, this isn't going to be a lore video, but if you're not familiar with the universe and the bolt gun itself, basically imagine a Mark 19 automatic grenade launcher, but it can be carried by hand, and also the grenades go faster. And also they tend to explode after penetrating something, like a person. So you might think, well, that would get pretty bloody, and yes folks, it does. In this game, you will quite literally paint the walls and floor with the blood and viscera of your enemies. Absolutely glorious. Hey, look everyone, it's the meat slide. Look at it go. First off, let me say that Boltgun, even on the default settings, is definitely not a bad looking game. As I alluded to before, some retro shooters I've seen take a low poly pixelated look too far, to the point where they just look like crap. Boltgun doesn't do that. Even on the default settings, your weapons and enemies look readily identifiable. One minor issue was the use of 2D sprites for the enemies. I realize it was easier than making even simple 3D rendered models, but it's kind of a weird mix, especially when you think about how 90s FPSs were usually either 2.5D like Doom or the build engine games, or full 3D like Quake. One reason why this can be a problem is in traditional 90s FPSs that use sprites, you usually didn't use mouse look if you even used the mouse at all. As such, you'd rarely be looking down at an enemy at a very steep angle, and in any game where you can do this, it'll always look very weird. Visually, I think the most impressive aspect of Boltgun is in the level design. One thing that a Medieval proved is that even if you're using lower resolution textures, you can really create some breathtaking vistas. I wouldn't say Boltgun goes as far as a Medieval in this respect, but it's still pretty impressive. Warhammer 40k is a universe based on excess and deliberately over-the-top everything. Everything you might find in other sci-fi universes is going to be bigger, louder, and more extreme in Warhammer 40k. Okay, let's see if this game conforms to the convention of Chekhov's giant gun. And that's 3. Alright, we got it. In the past, I noticed that even mediocre 40k games present you with some impressive locations and set pieces, and Boltgun definitely does this with its massive structures, manufactorums, and temples. Boltgun definitely captures the aesthetics and feel of the universe in a way that'd be instantly recognizable to anyone who's read some of the lore. And level design is a good place to segue into Boltgun's gameplay, because as is often the case with these retro shooters, the action isn't nearly as retro as you'd expect, and in some ways it features modern innovations found in more recent FPS games, like Doom Eternal. I mean, generally you shoot guys and hunt for keys, but oftentimes levels feature large arenas where you'll be forced to fight hordes of enemies spawning in, just like in Doom Eternal or Shadow Warrior 3. How well this works is a bit of a mixed bag. Your character is reasonably fast when running, and you can climb up ledges, usually, but the game is lacking the kind of mobility you'd want during such battles. Your jump is pretty high, but there is no double jumping. You have a dash, but it's actually an attack move as well, so there's a cooldown between uses. Obviously, you can't meat hook your way across the arena like in Doom Eternal, and you can't wall run, but there is a feature that can give you a little extra speed and even vertical mobility at times. See, in Boltgun, you've got your trusty chainsword, which can be instantly swung by using the right mouse button or pressing V at any time. This can be used to slow down time for a lock-on attack, which is instantly fatal to most smaller enemies. When you release the button, your character will charge the target to slash them with the chainsword, and in so doing, you can often reach higher levels or get across gaps too wide for normal jumping. And it's also just brutal to see and hear, so there's that. Excuse me, sir, do you have a moment to speak about the God Emperor of Mankind? Generally, this kind of combat is entertaining, but there are a few downsides. One is the game's tendency to spam a bunch of nuisance enemies at you to distract you. Another problem I've seen others rightly point out is the game's lack of damage feedback to let you know when you're losing too much health. The game is good at making you feel like a superhuman, well, Space Marine, as it lets you wade into hordes of enemies and bathe in their blood, often taking little to no damage. However, just like in Space Marine, in Boltgun there are times when you'll start to take significant, rapid damage, and suddenly you find yourself nearly dead. Also, some enemies can be extremely difficult to deal with given the weapons at your disposal and your mobility, but this was the kind of problem you could usually solve just by reloading your last save one time. Oh, and by some enemies, I mean these bastards right here. The Chaos Space Marine Aspiring Champions. If you see these guys, prioritize them first, and I recommend you don't stop shooting until they're completely gibbed. Yeah, why don't you aspire to catch these bolt rounds, dickhead? Now, unfortunately, the game has some real issues with enemy AI. You'll often see enemies staring you right in the face from a short distance away, yet they're seemingly unaware of you. In at least one case, I was able to shoot an enemy without them becoming aware. It's also often possible to cheese out enemies, even the mini-bosses, by getting them trapped partially behind an obstacle, a tactic I used successfully multiple times. This is a tricky topic in a 40k game because, on one hand, it makes sense that you should be able to plow through the game's human cultist enemies with ease, as this is exactly what happens in the 40k universe whenever Space Marines face ordinary humans. On the other hand, most of your Chaos Space Marine opponents don't match up to your mobility and speed and thus are not a challenge. The only ones that really give you serious problems are those aspiring champions I mentioned earlier. Apart from that, the enemies that tend to give you the most trouble do so primarily by being bullet sponges, or they'll be accompanied by massive waves of nuisance enemies. AI problems aside, the enemies deserve attention because they're one of the game's shining examples of faithfully representing the lore. In addition to Chaos Cultists, you'll face the heretic Chaos Space Marines of the Black Legion. There are lesser and greater demons of the Chaos God Nurgle and Tzeentch. But if you're a fan of the Blood God Horn, you're going to be disappointed. And of course they didn't include Slanesh shenanigans because they didn't want it to be a hentai game. Understandable. Now I realize that's very helpful for fans of the Warhammer 40k universe, but for some of you out there, what I just said about various enemies makes absolutely no sense. And since we gotta tackle the story, I'm gonna take a little bit of time just to briefly get you up to speed on Warhammer 40k lore.
It is the 41st millennium. For more than 100 centuries, the Emperor of Mankind has sat immobile on the golden throne of Earth. He is the master of mankind by the will of the gods, and the master of a million worlds by the might of his inexhaustible armies. He is a rotting carcass, writhing invisibly with power from the dark age of technology. He is the carrion lord of the vast imperium of man, for whom 1,000 souls are sacrificed every day so that he may never truly die.
Wait, so this emperor is alive or dead?
Only his psychic essence remains. Physically, he is dead. A corpse on the golden throne.
Wait, so 100 centuries? That's like 10,000 years. So the emperor died 10,000 years ago? Why isn't there another emperor or something?
The emperor was killed 10,000 years ago, at the end of the Horus heresy. When all seemed lost, the emperor and his greatest son, Sanguinius...
Wait, what's the Horus heresy?
The Horus heresy was a galactic civil war between those forces loyal to the emperor and traitors who sided with the rebel Primarch, Horus Lupercal. For years the galaxy burned, until the traitor armies reached Terra and laid siege to the Imperial Palace.
Okay, I'm sorry. Who is Horus exactly? What is a Primarch?
Oh, for throne's sake, a Primarch is one of 18 genetically engineered super beings designed by the Emperor to lead his armies across the galaxy in the Great Crusade.
Wait, Great Crusade and Chaos? What are the forces of Chaos?
Oh, shut up, you heretic.
Okay, seriously, as much as I like talking about Warhammer 40k lore, there's just no way to explain everything so you completely get the plot of this game. Luckily, it's pretty straightforward, so if you're a fan of the franchise, you're going to understand it immediately, and if you're new to it, it's simple enough for you to grasp. Emperor good, Chaos bad. If you played Space Marine from 2011, you might be interested to know that this game takes place on the same Forge world, Graia, that was featured in that game. Boltgun takes place years after the invasion of Graia by the Orcs and the subsequent Chaos outbreak. Your character, Malum Kaido, is a member of a team of Space Marines that have been seconded to an Inquisitor, who has tasked you with going down to the planet and investigating any traces of Chaos that may be left behind. Spoiler alert, there's a lot. You've definitely got signs of Chaos here. Yep, definitely Chaos here. I see you've got the warp bleeding through the walls over here. I'm afraid fixing this is going to cost you a pretty penny. Anyway, just as you might have guessed, your squad gets wiped out on landing, and as the sole survivor, you have to go complete the mission alone. Lucky for you, you're a Space Marine. You start the game with only your chainsword. But this is actually good because it lets you get used to the mechanics and the special attacks you can do with it. Soon afterwards, you get the titular Boltgun, and this is where the real fun begins. The Boltgun will basically splatter weaker enemies in 1 or 2 hits. But what's good about it is that it can take down stronger enemies pretty reliably even later in the game. You can also pick up different special rounds for it that'll make it even more powerful. After the Boltgun, you end up finding a shotgun. And the weird thing is, this is one of those FPSs where the shotgun isn't going to be your main workhorse here. That's definitely going to go to the Boltgun. That's not to say the shotgun is entirely useless. It's very good to use against nuisance enemies and some flying enemies. Next is the plasma rifle, and if you know Warhammer 40k, you gotta be careful with plasma rifles. Fire this thing too quickly and it'll start to harm you. There's also splash damage as well. Now here's one tip to help you out. There's an item in this game called the Machine Spirit, and it'll affect whatever weapon you have selected when you pick it up. In the case of the plasma rifle, it'll give you a higher rate of fire without the damage. Next you have the heavy bolter. Now I really like this machine gun. It will restrict your movement somewhat, but generally ammo is plentiful and the rate of fire isn't too fast. So as long as you have a clear field of fire, you're basically going to be mowing down enemies by the dozen with this thing. The Vengeance launcher from the Space Marine game makes a reappearance here. It's basically a sticky bomb launcher. Then you've got the devastating Melta Cannon. This thing is like a shotgun, but instead of pellets, it's shooting beams of superheated energy. Then you have 2 beam weapons, the Volkite Caliver and the Grav Cannon. The only difference I can see between the two is that the Grav Cannon is more powerful because wherever it hits, it creates splash damage. Both of these will typically chew through most enemies very quickly. For the most part, I like most of the weapons. Ammo is plentiful, especially for the bolt gun. And as I said before, the bolt gun will remain useful all the way through the game. Now, there is one strange feature that was confusing to some other reviewers, and I won't claim that I've mastered it myself, but the weapons and enemies in this game have a feature similar to the Warhammer 40k tabletop game, where your weapons have a strength rating and your enemies have a toughness rating. Strength and toughness are indicated by number values, which can be seen in your weapon selection menu and enemy health bars when you target them. Now, supposedly the way this works is if you use a weapon with higher strength than the enemy's toughness, they're going to take damage more rapidly. And keep in mind that getting the Machine Spirit will raise the strength value for some of your weapons. Now, did this mechanic really matter much in gameplay terms? I'd say no. Generally, more powerful weapons do more damage. So feel free to experiment with the strength toughness mechanic, but it's not like something you have to master to beat the game. Really all you need is old school FPS skills like circle strafing. In addition to your organic weapons, you also have 3 types of grenades: crack grenades, frag grenades, and a 3rd type of grenade you're only going to find in secrets. You can't really hold many grenades, but they're pretty common, and also the Chaos Space Marines will drop them sometimes. Okay, now there are a few, let's say, major gripes I have to talk about. For some reason, after certain levels, you'll lose all your weapons except for your Boltgun and Chainsword. This kind of thing made sense back in the days of shareware like Doom and Quake and Duke 3D, because shareware games are episodic. But this game is just one continuous run, and there's no real good reason given why you would lose your other weapons. To be sure, it's a minor irritation. Typically, you'll get your weapons back fairly quickly. It's just unexplained and unnecessary. Now, my biggest gripe has to do with the level design, and I know earlier I said that the level design is one of the strong points of this game. Visually, sure. However, there were a few moments in this game where I found myself almost hopelessly lost. You have a lot of corridors that look almost identical and loop around to each other, and once you've killed all the enemies in that area, it's not clear where you need to go. And one level even features this beautifully designed but utterly frustrating puzzle-like sequence where you have to go through various portals, and you're just constantly looping around in this MC Escher-like maze with literally nothing to guide you as to where you should be going or what's progress or not. I just got through it with random guessing. Now, I mean, from a lore perspective, I can kind of appreciate part of a level trying to replicate the mind-bending, irrational influence of the Chaos God Tzeentch, but it's not something you want to see in a fast-paced hack-and-slash shooter game. It just completely destroys the pacing. Finally, the bosses in the game are kind of weak and repetitive. They're not really very challenging to fight either. You just have to deal with hordes of other enemies, or sometimes enemies are spawning in while you're fighting. In the end, I think your biggest problem you're going to find is lack of replayability. I mean, there are additional harder difficulty levels, and I'm sure you could give yourself little challenges like a chainsword only run, but there's nothing like an endless horde mode or even multiplayer to stretch out that time. But at the end of the day, the game's full price on Steam is $21.99. So if that's a problem for you, just wait till it goes on sale. Warhammer 40k games tend to be a lot more misses than hits, but Boltgun is a very solid game with plenty of references and Easter eggs from the lore for fans, yet it's accessible enough for newcomers to the universe. What other positives can I add? The music is fairly decent. Some of it inexplicably reminded me of the soundtrack from the Sega Genesis version of Alien 3, which is a positive point in my book since I loved that game as a kid. At my age, gore is not a big draw, but I can say teenage me would have absolutely loved this, and I can appreciate it for that. Also, if you find yourself lost or you just want to spice up the battles a little, there's a taunt key that makes your character shout dozens of hilarious threats and other lines.
Tear out your heart, spill your blood, the Emperor, in holy fire, for the Imperium, chaos filth.
Duke Nukem had action movie lines.
Holy shit.
Caleb had Army of Darkness and show tunes.
I get no kick from champagne.
Lo Wang had...
Who want some wang?
yeah. And here you have Malum Kaido with...
I am an executioner of the Emperor. None can stand against our hatred. Suffer not the heretics to live. Glory to mankind.
Hey, I recognize that line.
Glory to mankind!
Didn't expect to see a reference to Nier Automata in here, did you? The funny thing is, using these taunts has virtually no gameplay function, yet I found myself randomly using them when initiating battles just for fun. It really adds narrative to the game. And speaking of character, if you leave him idle, he'll whip out a copy of the Codex Astartes and start thumbing through it like a good little Ultramarine.
Here we go, Chapter 4, Chaos Outbreaks.
So yeah, that about wraps it up. It's a pretty solid game. Interesting take on a retro shooter, but incorporating some of the latest developments in FPS games. I just really wish it changed the default settings, because as I alluded to earlier, once you change those so-called retro settings, the game looks a lot better and it just feels better. It came up lacking in a few key areas, but I'm really hoping that in the future the devs will continue to support the game, create downloadable content, and maybe add features like multiplayer or additional modes, because it really shows a lot of potential. Alright, that's the review. Thanks for watching. As always, I ask you to like, share, subscribe, and check the description below for the link to my Patreon page where you can support my work. I really appreciate it. Once again, thanks for watching, and I will catch you next time. Slava Ukraini.
Glory to mankind.
Yeah, we'll work on that.